explain to the audience what exactly MBR is, or muscle to bone ratio. Number two, so that's number one. Number two, how you measure it. And number three, the potential applications for it.
Yeah, well, let me give you a little bit of context behind this. You know, I spent, as you mentioned, a little bit in my bio, I spent 19 years in college prior to my 4 years in the NFL. And quite often the question that gets asked in college football, and still was asked 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and still to this day, is simply, how big can this young man get? And when that question's asked, coaches aren't asking how much adipose mass he can put on. They're asking how much lean muscle mass can his skeleton hold. And for years, and still to this day, there's a lot of subjective responses to that, right? And oftentimes, you know, you refer to the coach's eye, right? A coach has had several years of experience, can often make a very accurate subjective guess at where an athlete's final resting point for lean muscle mass will be, but oftentimes they can. And so it's usually based upon frame size. We look at shoulder widths, just as a subjective assessment, shoulder widths, the amount of muscle mass he currently has, how lean is he, what's his training history, what's his nutritional background, things like that. And we make guesses. And quite honestly, I thought when I got to the NFL, those questions would diminish to some degree simply because of the age of the athlete. Now we're not dealing with 18-year-olds, we're dealing with 22 to 36-year-olds, and you know, in some cases. And so I thought those questions would be diminished a bit, but in fact, they became more prevalent, or as prevalent. And so when you're sitting in the draft room and the owner or the GM asks you, you know, you want to move an outside linebacker to defensive end, let's say, and you're going to give him a huge signing bonus to sign him to a 4-year rookie contract, that question is pretty important, that you have a fairly accurate answer to, and something besides a subjective guess. And so I spent, 8 to 12 months just researching, and there's not much out there, to be honest with you, researching absolute muscle mass carrying capability of a skeletal frame. Went so far as to look at the cattle industry. When they butcher cattle, and the weight of the carcass versus the weight of the skeleton. There's some things in the animal kingdom, and it kind of, it's all the time I'm searching. And you mentioned Francis Hallway, and I ran across Francis, and Francis has data on 25 years of athletes from the Olympics, from every sport. So that piqued my interest. The other thing was we were playing a Monday night game in San Francisco, and I was getting graded compression socks, knee-high compression socks for every one of our players. And to do that accurately, you need some ankle circumference measures and calf circumference measures. And we had a running back on the team who you guys probably know well, who had the third largest ankle circumference on the team. And this particular individual also has enormous calves, huge quads, glutes, very muscular lower body, with a very large lower body skeletal frame. And so that's when things all just kind of came together. And I'm going, you know what? The size of the skeleton has to, in large part, dictate muscle carrying capability of that particular skeleton, which makes complete sense, right? It's logical. Muscles are attached to tendons are attached to bones. And so the skeletal frame will not put on more muscle mass than it's capable of carrying safely. Not only for performance, but to mitigate risk. And so throughout the process, I'm still researching, I'm pulling articles, and you know, at this point, we're 4 years into it. And the muscle to bone ratio, to kind of circle back to the original question, the muscle to bone ratio is simply that. It's the amount of muscle mass per pound of skeletal weight. Okay. So if I've got a 20-pound skeleton and 100 pounds of lean muscle mass, I've got a 5.0 muscle to bone ratio, right? 100 divided by 20. How we measure this is a method of anthropometry. All manual anthropometry. It's not based upon Bob Potter DEXA, although we are drawing some correlation with DEXA measures. And it's a 5-way fractionation. And for the listeners who don't understand that terminology, something like a bod pod, I think that a lot of people are familiar with, is a 2-compartment model, which essentially the bod pod gives you fat mass, which is adipose mass, and lean body mass. And the terminology in that particular situation with the bod pod, lean body mass means everything that's not fat, which includes muscle weight, the weight of the skin, the weight of the skeleton, organs, any residual mass, anything that's not fat. That's not muscle mass. Sometimes we make the mistake. I've heard several people make the mistake of calling lean body mass muscle mass. Not the same thing, completely different.
Right.
And so in the 2-compartment model, we still don't know how much muscle mass is on the frame. We get closer to DEX. The DEX is a 3-compartment model. We get lean mass, we get fat mass, and we get bone mineral content. Bone mineral content in that scenario is not the weight of the skeleton. It's typically about a third of the weight of the actual skeleton. And these measures, these measures were validated. This is the only method validated with complete dissection of cadavers. And this was done 40 years ago. So they dissected cadavers, put in their constituent pieces, kind of organize this against a phantom model. And they've come up with algorithms to determine 5-way fractionation. So in other words, when we do these measures, and it's about 24 to 25 anthropometric measures, we're getting the weight of 5 different compartments. And those 5 compartments, if valid, would add up the entire weight of the individual's body mass. So the 5 compartments are adipose, skeletal weight, muscle mass, weight of the skin, and then organs and residual mass. And the organs and residual mass, obviously you're not weighing organs. That was what the phantom model was used for years ago, to determine kind of in a body frame of this size, here's the typical weight of the organs and the residual mass. From that, so now we have absolute measures. We have an absolute measure of the skeletal weight. We have an absolute measure of the muscle mass. We have an absolute measure of the adipose mass of the individual. From there, that's how we determine the muscle to bone ratio. So in other words, again, I'll go back to that. If I've got a 20-pound skeleton and 100 pounds of muscle mass on the individual, that's a 5.0 muscle to bone ratio. Now, that in and of itself doesn't mean a whole lot. We find there are 2 primary factors, and there could be more, but there's 2 primary factors that determine how much muscle mass an individual can hold. And those are simply the weight of the skeleton and the ethnicity of the individual. African Americans can hold 5.9 to 6.0 pounds of muscle for every pound of skeletal weight. Certainly, like every other calculation and every other cohort or population, there are outliers to that. Caucasians, about 5.5 pounds of muscle for every pound of skeletal weight. Polynesians are somewhere in between. Based upon our data set, they're somewhere in between. I'll say this a lot of times, I think, in this podcast, that the strength coach in me feels very strongly about a lot of the things I'm saying almost as factual. The scientist in me says we need more data, right? So with some of the South Pacific Islanders and Polynesians, we need a little more data, but they fall somewhere in between those 2 ranges. The application is what's exciting to me as performance specialists. So what we've done is, and so we can work in terms of maximal. When a coach says, or practitioner says, how much weight can this athlete hold? We can work in terms of maximal, certainly. And if you're a bodybuilder, a power lifter, a shot putter, in American football, if you're on the interior offensive line or interior defensive line, then certainly we can talk about maximals. Outside of that, we need to start talking about optimals. What's the optimal muscle to bone ratio for this athlete and for their not only sporting demands, but within the sport, their position specific demand. And we find, and based upon years of Olympic data, I'll give you an example. Like a triathlete would be about a 3.5 to 3.6 pounds of muscle for every pound of skeletal weight. That's optimal based upon medal winners in the Olympics. English Premier Soccer players are going to be between 4.2 and 4.5 pounds of muscle for every pound of skeletal weight. So you can see the higher the demand for movement, the lower the optimal muscle to bone ratio for that particular athlete or for that particular sport typically is. Again, there are outliers to everything. So one of our goals 3 or 4 years ago was to determine optimal muscle to bone ratios. And in football, we've got several different positions, a lot of different position specific demands. What are the optimal muscle to bone ratios for football players by position? And certainly it varies as an individual as well. Well, what did we look to? We had shot putters and discus throwers from the Olympics. We had rugby league, every position in rugby league. What we didn't have was American football. And so we had to establish these. And so for the last 4 years, we've measured Senior Bowls, combine class, two NFL combine classes, 8 to 10 full or partial rosters of NFL teams, NBA teams, NHL teams, Major League Baseball teams. So we've got more data points. Probably, I feel confident about that than anyone with these particular measures. So now we've established, and not to mention college football teams, our school here, there's several teams we're getting calls from in college that want this done. And so we've accrued a lot of data. And then we follow up the data with practical applications for these schools because we do have the data. And I'll give you an example. And most of this is anecdote. We've not published any studies. Right now,